So now we've engaged both how we should think about race and fundamental issues related to racism. We now want to turn to roles that race and racism play in certain aspects of our lives. We will begin with education, and tomorrow we will engage politics, medicine and health, and art and artistic representations. To help us think about race and education, we have Doctors Lawrence Blum and John Torrey. Dr. Lawrence Blum is a professor of philosophy and distinguished professor of liberal arts and education emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He earned his PhD from Harvard University. Professor Blum writes on race and education and is the author of 3 books in that area. I Am Not a Racist, But The Moral Quandary of Race, which was winner of the North American Society of Social Philosophy's Book of the Year, High Schools, Race, and America's Future, and is the co-author of Integrations, The Struggle for Racial Equality and Civic Renewal, which is forthcoming this April, and on which his talk will be based. The title of Professor Blum's presentation is Social Integration Cannot Bring About Educational Equality, but is the essential foundation for civic education in a multicultural democracy, or multiracial democracy, excuse me. Our second speaker in the session on race and education will be John Torrey. Dr. John Torrey is an assistant professor of philosophy and a contributing professor in the Africana Studies department at SUNY Buffalo State College. He earned his PhD in philosophy from the University of Memphis. Professor Torrey is published on the theoretical underpinnings of the Black Lives Matter movement and on doing pre-college philosophy. Further, Professor Torrey was featured on the Unmute podcast in 2020. Professor Torrey has developed pre-college philosophy programs since 2010, including the Buffalo State Lyceum, and currently serves on the board of Plato, which stands for the Philosophy, Learning, and Teaching Organization. All right, so please silently help me welcome Doctors Blum and Torrey.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this conference. I'm also very pleased to be on the same, whatever we call this, stage or set with John Torrey. Hi, John, I haven't seen you in a while. Sounds like you're up to some great things that are continuous with what you have, the kind of outreach program stuff that we've talked about years ago. So I'm focused on the K through 12 domain of education, and I'm going to speak about the relationship between school integration and educational equality, and also school integration and civic education. The equality question is difficult to get a handle on because often the idea of integration is understood in such a way that it already involves equality. To say that a school is integrated is to imply that it delivers equal education to all its students, regardless of their racial group. This understanding would make the statement, racial integration brings about racial equality, true by definition, and therefore not very interesting. What we really want to know is whether integration in the sense of bringing students of different races into the same educational space results in equal educational outcomes among the different racial groups in the school. The term race, just a little background, the term integration has several distinct historical meanings that's worth laying out a bit. So I'll mention 3 of them. The first, which was the sense of integration in the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954. Integration there meant what's also called desegregation, which is essentially saying that the legal structure that supported white supremacy in the form of Jim Crow segregation was unconstitutional. And the school systems that operated by assigning people explicitly according to their race to different schools was unconstitutional. That's one meaning. A different meaning is the descriptive meaning implied in that one, which is, the Brown meaning did not mandate that schools were required to actually bring students of different racial backgrounds into the same school. It simply said that you couldn't explicitly keep them from being in the same school. The second meaning is a descriptive meaning, and it simply means the co-presence of different racial groups in the same school. So that's the second meaning of integration. The third meaning of integration builds on the descriptive meaning, but it adds certain ideals or values on top of the mixed demographic. So Martin Luther King, for example, had a very eloquent description of integration as a kind of sense of spiritual unity. And he said that if you had different groups in the same space, but not sort of connecting to each other through respect and care and concern and love, then that wasn't really integration. So that sense of integration requires the descriptive level, the co-presence of different racial groups, but it goes beyond that to have certain ideals. And I've just given you one of the possible ideals that could be present there. Okay, first, a few observations about the idea of equal education. For those of you involved in the K through 12 world, the term equity is now used more frequently than equality, but I prefer the older term equality. In my book, my co-author and I argue that equality of education should be understood as the delivering of a range of educational goods to all students, goods such as mastery of subject matter, intellectual and personal growth, moral development, civic engagement, and others. I'll have to leave this idea of educational goods at the intuitive level for this presentation, but it's given a lot of detail in the book. The main point I want to make is that in the deeply unjust society in which we currently live, it's not possible to achieve racial equality in the K through 12 educational domain. The wider injustice in society is of both a race and a class character. Race and class cannot be entirely separated from each other in this context of the injustices of society. In every major domain of social and economic existence, health and healthcare, housing, income, wealth, occupation, the US is characterized by extreme disparities of both a class and a race character. The COVID period has both exposed these disparities for all to see acutely, as well as further exacerbating them. Although, of course, disadvantaged Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people, as well as many whites, have recognized these inequalities for many years. These larger structural inequities, which I agree with Charles Mills in referring to as white supremacy, impact the world of schooling in many ways. I'll mention two of them. One is the impact of poverty on learning. Students from poor backgrounds may have the same innate potential for learning and as much desire to learn as well-off students, but they suffer disadvantages that make it more challenging to educate them as a group to the same level as the advantaged students as a group. For example, on average, the students in poverty tend to be sicker because of living in less healthy conditions and having lesser access to high quality health care, resulting in missing more school days, not being able to give as good attention to one's schoolwork. Their diets tend to be less healthy. They also live in more stressful circumstances because of their families' lesser resources. They might have housing insecurity as well. Now, heroic schools and teachers can sometimes bring equal educational goods to these students, but in the big picture, until the larger injustices in those other domains are rectified, until society abolishes poverty, actual equality of education is not achievable. Although, of course, this does not mean that disadvantaged students cannot make substantial educational progress. It's only that the equality ideal can't be attained. And poverty can be abolished. This is not a pipe dream. As you know, some positive steps have been taken in that direction, such as the push for a $15 minimum wage that's been implemented in various parts of the country and is part of President Biden's COVID relief bill. A second way the white supremacist structure of society impacts the world of K-12 education is through what is called opportunity hoarding by advantaged families, which are not only but are disproportionately white. Advantaged families can pass down educational advantages to their children in several ways, from spending money on educational enrichment outside of school, hiring private tutors to help them with their schoolwork and do better on standardized tests, and using their race and class standing to advocate for their children to be advantaged in the school, for example, by being put in advanced classes or getting the teachers that those parents think their kids should have. We can see the clear effects of this opportunity hoarding at the high school level in the now well-known fact that selected colleges around the country admit wildly disproportionate percentages of wealthy students. One mind-boggling statistic being that at 12 highly ranked colleges, these are very top colleges, more students come from the top 1% of the income scale than the bottom 50%. That's a truly astounding statistic, given that people think of admission to higher education as being a meritocracy, where the people with the most ability bubble to the top. Is just obviously impossible that there are 50 times as much talent in the 1% as in the bottom 50%. Unless the society becomes more equal and wealth is not permitted to translate so substantially into educational advantage, it will be impossible to achieve educational equality. Unfortunately, while there have been some fitful attempts to challenge the power and degree of wealth of the wealthy in our society, for example, in the Sanders and Warren campaigns for president in 2020, the society remains quite plutocratic in this regard, contributing to its white supremacist character. Bringing this back to the educational equality issue, it is not possible to achieve educational equality across society and across racially defined groups as long as the outer society within which the educational sector is set remains as extremely racially unjust as it currently is. Initiatives and movements for educational equality must link up with movements for equality in other sectors to change the situation. This point implies that descriptive integration cannot bring about educational equality because it's a reform that takes place only within the school and does not correct for nor attempt to challenge injustices in the outer society. It is simply not adequate to the task of bringing about educational equality. But someone might reply, isn't it true that on the whole, schools with primarily Black and Latinx populations tend to be less good schools with fewer resources in relation to the needs of the students, a higher percentage of students in poverty, higher turnover of teachers, and teachers on the whole with inferior qualifications compared to middle-class white dominant schools? Yes, that is certainly true, but this simply shows that the inferior resources granted to schools with students of color compared to white students reflects and is caused by the white supremacist and class stratified character of our society. It does not show that the racial demographic of the different schools is the cause of their having such different resources. Consider two schools that differ in their demographic. One is well integrated with a critical mass of students of several racial groups. The other is an all-Black school. But they have the same quality of teacher and stability of the teaching force in the school. They have an identical economic profiles of students, equal percentages of students in poverty, middle-class students, and so on, and the same resources for the two schools in general. Only this scenario permits us to raise the question about the impact of a student's racial demographic alone on its achievement of educational equality. Once resource differences in economic demographics are brought in, we are no longer investigating the question we initially posed. Does descriptive integration itself bring about educational equality? So I can't further address this question, but I do think the discussion allows us to see, or at least strongly suggest, that racial demography alone is only weakly related to school quality. There are many excellent schools that are all Black or say all Navajo, such as the Rough Rock Demonstration School that my co-author and I discuss in the book, or all Latino, or all some mixture of students of color. When the justices in the Brown decision famously said, separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, this point served the cause of justice in that particular case, but it is very misleading as a general statement, and it contributes to the idea that an all-Black school cannot be an excellent school, as well as to the idea that an integrated demographic itself serves the cause of educational equality. The only reason all-Black schools tend to be unequal in our society is simply that our white supremacist society is organized so that such schools are inadequately resourced. Although one-race dominant schools bear only a weak relationship, if any at all, to educational equality if all other variables are held constant, they do suffer one significant educational deficiency. They do not provide optimal settings for civic education, preparing future citizens for life and engagement in a multiracial democracy with a history and present of severe racial injustice. Civil education has been a core component of the purposes of public education since the creation of the public school system in the US in the 19th century. The Brown decision affirmed that education is the foundation of good citizenship. Civic education has fallen on hard times more recently in the rise of neoliberal approaches to education that emphasize preparation for the job market, subjects assessed by standardized tests, which civics tends not to be, and it would be actually difficult to do so, the economic value of education, and a more general privatizing of the goods of education so that the public good, the civic good aspect of education is lost. Race-informed civic education is best carried out in integrated classrooms and schools. The presence of multiple groups renders students more interested in learning about groups other than their own because members of those groups are present in the classroom and may come to be friends of theirs. Students can learn habits of respectful engagement with racial others that they can't do in one race, sole one race or one race dominant schools. The diversity of backgrounds and experiences enriches education for all students, and they are more likely to gain an accurate picture of their society as a whole and who populates it than in single race classrooms. They will be more open to learning about the unjust structures of their actual society because the presence of disadvantaged students in the class will be a source of experience of discrimination and disadvantage that the advantaged students can learn from in a way they would not be able to in the standard all-white classroom. It will be a setting in which the disadvantaged students can also learn to understand their own experiences better by comparing and analyzing them with other disadvantaged students with different experiences. All the students will benefit from a greater understanding of the structures of injustice presented by their teachers that are seldom fully visible at the pure experiential level. It must be admitted that this is an area in which the advantaged students have much more to gain than the disadvantaged in a civic understanding of injustice, though a confrontation with their own unearned privilege will not be comfortable. It shows that civic education cannot rely on the mixed demographic alone, that is descriptive integration, but requires skillful and racially sensitive teaching that creates a community of respect and equality inside the classroom and the school. In this way, the full benefits of civic education for multiracial democracy requires elements of ideal integration, not merely descriptive integration, but descriptive integration is a necessary condition for it. The racially diverse classroom and school is a more favorable setting for nurturing a sense of justice and injustice that should inform the future citizen than in an all-white school, though this may not be the case for an all-Black and brown school, where a sense of justice can also be well nurtured, and such students, in fact, often take civic initiative to protest injustice while still in high school. The racially diverse classroom also permits the teacher to form racially mixed groups of students to work together on civic projects, providing invaluable preparation for civic engagement with racial others concerning racial issues. Arguing that integrated schools are the most favorable setting for civic education for multicultural democracy is in no way to say that white dominant schools cannot provide any version of such civic education, but this is an argument in favor of both descriptive and ideal integration that does not rely on a spurious claim about the promotion of educational equality and does speak to a core function of education.
Thank you. Very interesting. And now, Dr. Torrey.
Thank you, Dr. Barnes, for inviting me and making me sound like I'm a really important person, apparently, according to that bio I sent you. I need to trim that down. And it's great to see you, Dr. Blum. It's been forever. Always wonderful to share space with you and be able to share ideas. So it's, again, a great honor. So I'm going to be reading off of a computer to the left. So, if I'm doing this, I don't have a neck problem. I'm making it work. And if for some reason you hear footsteps, it's not me, it's the dog. So I have my dog treats ready to go in case she's getting antsy. So, okay. National Flashpoints as a form of education about race. I came to this project thinking about, again, the protests from last year, but also from years prior, certainly as far back as Mike Brown in 2014, prior to that, Trayvon Martin, I believe in 2012, and the shifts in terms of attitudes that seems to have developed over that time period. And so this project serves to kind of discuss what the makeup of that shift in attitudes might be and how it might be going on. So Black History Month, we're in it, right? Happy Black History Month, everybody. Black history is American history. This is one of the reasons why Black History Month was created. February here's a month to herald the accomplishments, the achievements, and the lived experience of Black people of all stripes, from all eras, and much better, and of all kinds, as a way to restore the dignity of Black people inside the American consciousness. Carter G. Woodson, who created Black History Week, which would become Black History Month, recognized the importance of what it means to communicate consistently a message about the value of Black life in America from the perspective of Black people. Quoting here from Woodson, we should emphasize not Negro history, but the Negro in history. This is something he wrote in the Negro History Week circular in 1927. What's clear from the litany of non-Black people who are shocked by the level of outrage displayed at the murder of Black people across the country, from Trayvon to Michael to Tamir to Sandra to Breonna to Eric to George to Ahmaud to Daniel to whomever is unfortunately next, is that there's been little done to provide the emphasis Woodson desired a century ago about the Black experience in America. And it's not that people are unaware. Right. So mainstream America has a very implicit understanding that Black life is not a form of what we might call an ideal American life. So Jane Elliott, the famed anti-racist educator, once held a forum and asked if any white people in the audience would stand up if they would accept the same treatment that society gives to Black people. So nobody moved. So she remarked again, stand up. Did you hear me? I want to make sure I'm not being misunderstood. And of course, nobody moved. So she goes, that says very plain, I'm quoting from her here, that says very plainly that you know what's happening. You know you don't want it for you. I want to know why you're so willing to accept it or allow it to happen for others. Her remarks support my view that a lack of awareness isn't really the sole problem. On my view here, one of the big issues is, to borrow from Woodson, that we've been miseducated in a way to consider this version of Black life that we've implicitly accepted to be, well, again, acceptable, albeit an unfortunate facet of American life. The thesis of Woodson's Miseducation, which is boiling it down kind of quick here, that schools culturally inculcate Black people to kind of accept the racial hierarchy that we have as an appropriate norm, also serves as a reminder for what's being inculcated for all students, which is knowing about the Black experience is kind of an optional pursuit, not really a necessary one, save for a brief detour through slavery, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X. In this paper, I'm going to argue that a key mechanism for how changing how we educate about race in recent years has been outrage and the calls for social justice in response to anti-Black injustice. Here I'm thinking of about education here specifically as an institution, but with an eye towards the K through 12 arena as opposed to the collegiate and above arena. Okay, so whether these changes are done because of a change in moral and political stance, or to kind of keep up with the times, so to speak, and avoid social castigation, don't want to be seen as the one that's taking too long to catch up. School districts and states around the country have revisited their approach to discussing race and Black history and other versions of race in America. It suggests that one of the most influential ways for causing a change is through what I call flashpoints, nationally known incidents of violent racial injustice, like the viral murders of Black people at the hands of police or by vigilantes. They serve as moments that produce a space where the possibility of actually being able to educate about race becomes available due to a larger swath of the country becoming engaged in these matters. If what I'm saying is right, however, or is tracking, it may produce a bit of a catch-22, and but what I'll close out the presentation chatting about is if the most efficient way or inefficient way to generate this kind of social change and educating about race is through the death of Black people, it seems like we don't have much hope for a policy change besides waiting on another viral murder. So part one here of this paper, I'm going to talk about how we currently educate about race, and that'll feature, of course, the lovely stuff we do in Black History Month. And part two, we'll talk a little bit more about flashpoints and how they serve as pathways to educate about race. And I'll conclude wondering about how can this be utilized and if there's a way around this catch-22. So part one, we're educating on race. Education is an institution that inculcates values to its participants. Children are taught about how to behave, how to stand in line, take turns, share, and we're even reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. And this is all part of the early school inculcation of values. Additional civic virtues are taught as valuable to students, like mutual respect for others' ways of life. I'm not the same as you, and you're not the same as me, and I have to respect that. Fairness is another measure that we get taught, and of course, tolerance. Besides transmitting behavioral and civic values that are central to being a member of society, education also transmits information that it purports to be accurate. So it's working on two levels, right? It's not just giving the values, but it's also saying what we tell you is probably true. So school teaches many students not just how they should behave in the world, but also what is basically assumed to be universally accepted pieces of information. So, when you leave your math class and you go around saying 2 + 2 is 4, you feel pretty confident that when you tell this to other people, you're going to get a similar response, right? This is the kind of level of power that school has when it comes to how we understand information in our world, and how we also what we also expect others to understand with regards to the information in our world. So school education as an institution is granted with the power to offer information to its participants. And since we have a national requirement that children attend school until the age of 16, save for a handful of exceptions, education's a uniquely located institution at the intersection of both value distribution as well as knowledge distribution. So again, it's playing an important dual role for how we understand the world. It also, as an institution, has a goal of teaching the value of mutual respect for different ways of life. So it means it's determining by way of choosing how to tell the cultural narrative of the country and your locale, right? So not just the country, but also your city and your state, and even more specifically your neighborhood, depending on the school you're talking about. It's going to tell you that narrative, and it'll demonstrate that certain values are the ways of life that we ought respect. So in that way, it authorizes how Black children should be treated compared to non-Black children, as well as authoritatively providing the accuracy within the cultural narrative about the Black experience in America for the overwhelming majority of Americans. So it'll tell you not just how Black children should be treated, which is also how Black people should be treated, but it'll also provide what we take to be the standard cultural narrative of Black life in America, okay? With regards to how Black students are treated, there are a number of studies that show how Black students are disciplined more harshly, more often, and are the recipients of less academic, instructional attention than their non-Black counterparts. And a brief example, you'll see there have been viral moments of Black children being punished for wearing their natural hair in schools, as well as school-sanctioned athletic competitions. One moment I will never forget is seeing a high school student have his hair get cut off by a referee while he is sobbing before he gets to participate, in order to participate, in fact, in a wrestling match. So it'll teach students how to be treated and that it's okay to treat them like this. On the other end of this, education as an institution has an authoritative position with regard to the accuracy of a cultural narrative. Again, schools designed to tell students about the world they're in and how it came to be. This level of authority, however, also allowed textbooks to be printed and shipped that referred to slaves as immigrant workers, which that's not a mistake in degree. That is a mistake in category. It's a completely different scenario, and it certainly helps wash over or make seem a whole lot lighter the difficulties that enslaved people felt and faced, and the legacies coming from that. This textbook, of course, wasn't a one-off. As for many people, they don't receive a genuine effort at education, a genuine effort at being educated about the brutalities of being enslaved, nor the history of the people who were enslaved as having more than a beginning as slaves. So I'm quoting here from Dr. Daniel Berry. Those that populated the colonies were free people from communities in Africa with large-scale civilizations that had tax systems, that had irrigation systems, that had universities. They came from civilized nations that were advanced. That's where the curriculum should begin. It's an erasure of culture and heritage so that identities of African Americans for some are that of slaves and those fighting for their freedom, end quote. Considering the unfortunate racial bias that exists in schools, from leadership to the teachers and staff, education performs an additional role of reifying the cultural narrative through its treatment of Black students as well as its depiction of Black life in America. With a combination of largely unchecked racial bias, as well as being an authority of knowledge as two features of our education systems, we shouldn't be surprised at a lack of knowledge on how deeply ingrained anti-Black discrimination and injustice are, nor how essential Black people have been to the development and successes in this country. This is because we don't talk about race, a function of which is this is a development because of our lack of education about race within our national educational standards, as well as state and local standards. There is no federal mandate to teach Black history. A 2015 report from the Southern Poverty Law Center notes that the civil rights movement often becomes simplified to, quoting here, a handful of heroic figures and the 4 words, I have a dream. A 2015 study from the National Museum on African American History and Culture found that on average, only 8 to 9% of history class time is devoted to Black history. The story, of course, can be quickly summarized like this. Black people were slaves, then Lincoln the Great Freedom, then, it was like everyone was okay for a little bit. Then civil rights happened because Black people wanted to vote, and Dr. King got killed and everything kind of played out all right afterwards. We've been okay. That's kind of the story that's been spun out, and that's kind of the story that's the status quo. With concerns, of course, about this story being sanitized, having been raised since scholars like Woodson, if not beforehand, we might say that with regards to race, again, we have been miseducated. So it shouldn't be a surprise that Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo's books flew off the shelves last summer. The average American has not had much, if any, formal or informal education about the history and nature of race in America. We can surmise they received, at most, on average here, around 20 days of instruction in the shortest month of the year by a population that is mostly white and female at the pre-college level and mostly white and male at the college level. That so many people are unaware of the anti-Black injustice taking on forms like chattel slavery, formal ostracization by the country following emancipation, sundown towns, Jim Crow laws, Plessy v. Ferguson ruling, restricting access to property ownership, restricting voting rights, voter disenfranchisement, misrepresentations of Black people in the news using racist stereotypes like welfare queens and thugs, and outright, of course, anti-Black violence like lynch mobs and the stuff we're seeing that goes viral. We shouldn't be surprised that people aren't unaware, or that people are unaware of this because they've had very little education regarding this. Quoting here from Jeff Snyder about Carter Woodson's Miseducation. Miseducation advanced what is arguably the most fundamental tenet of progressive pedagogy, which is that education must be relevant. Students' backgrounds, needs, and interests should drive the curriculum. Perhaps, quote, end quote, perhaps it is that Black life in America, excuse me, and the perils as well as its successes have not been made relevant in a meaningful enough way to generate policy changes in how we educate about Black history. So what could generate some of these policy changes? Well, I'm sure you all, maybe not all of you, but I'm sure a good number of you has seen some Black person, likely a Black male, get murdered at the hands of police and watch it on YouTube or your Facebook or Twitter or something along those lines. And I'm sure you can recall what it feels like to have to watch that and feel kind of helpless and go, well, that something about that doesn't feel right, and why does this continue? For some, this is to echo the work of Bill Lawson. This is that feeling of social disappointment where this continues to exist and continues to persist, and we have no sense of why. Well, we have a sense of why, but there's still a sense of dread every time things go haywire and somebody ends up harmed. These viral moments of anti-Black injustice, which many which are punctuated with death, produce passionate responses, unlike anything we've seen more or less for 2 generations. It's in these moments that there's no way to hide from the stain of racial injustice. I can remember talking with a number of colleagues, and this is a moment, seeing that video just puts a pause on understanding on racial injustice, and made them have to take a moment to really gauge and see how well they've had a sense on how widespread racial injustice is. Chris Rock once said that we have, quoting here, the nicest white people in history right now. And this might be evidenced by how responses have developed in the aftermath of anti-Black injustice. So we've seen the public recently condemn people who are calling the police on Black people for doing mundane things like barbecuing at the park and golfing and moving into apartments and shopping for prom outfits and bird watching in Central Park. I surmise this is probably because America doesn't like its dirty laundry aired, and it certainly threatens to reveal the presence of racism and racial injustice in our country. So we would like to publicly elbow that. That said, it's a marked difference in how the nation responds to exhibitions of hatred between, this generation and, again, go back 2 or 3 generations past. Before, it might be considered a persnickety piece of the Americana pie. Now it seems to be seen more as a problem that requires creative solutions to address. Each time that we've seen these violent, viral moments of anti-Blackness, it's forced public discussions, in part because of the nature of the medium that we see them on, right? It's on social media. And these are discussions that frequently were private. They're now coming out in the public. We're getting live streams of folks being assaulted or murdered. This medium provokes, in fact, conversations and communication about how did this happen and why did this happen? And it seems about that after nearly a decade of Flashpoints, it's as though the public at large is beginning to veer from what did this person do to earn this to nobody deserves to experience this. And these flashpoints seem to do what our formal and informal education systems have largely failed to do, which is provide that space to requires that discussion on how racial injustice continues to persist, and more importantly, what can be done to change it. If you look at the makeup of the crowds of say, again, I use police brutality as kind of easy to point at moments here, but if you look at the crowds from mostly people of color, say in 2012 and 2014, to wholly diverse crowds all of last year in the summertime, protesting across the country. This could be understood as evidence of some sort that they are, in fact, learning something about the Black experience and the nature of race through these flashpoints, continuously bringing the issue to the forefront, whether it's on their televisions or their tablets. At the curriculum level, we're seeing places in Kentucky, Oklahoma, and Texas, and more, changing their state requirements to improve the representation of Black history to, again, more accurately portray what's occurred both nationally and locally in their history. While some of these measures, of course, were not done specifically in response to the Floyd and Taylor protests of last summer, they could very well be seen as a response to the years of protests prior and years of flashpoints prior, in a way that set the tone for having to, how do I say this, having to discuss these issues in a way that can be beneficial for students who are actively living through these social changes, which also in Texas includes the establishment of African-American history elective courses for high schoolers, right? Quoting here from LeGarrette King, who's I think head of the Woodson Center at the University of Missouri. The Black history curriculum needs to come from a Black perspective with topics specifically geared towards the Black experience. And many times these narratives are and need to be independent of the way we typically frame US history. The curriculum will need to balance narratives of victimhood, oppression, perseverance, and resistance. But unlike current renditions of the curriculum, it should contextualize issues that connect with the present. End quote. I got a brief bit here about the 1776 Project, which is, of course, another response to these flashpoints. Again, if the public outcries tends to lean on the side of racial injustice is bad, the 1776 Project, which is designed to help a rising generation understand the history and principles of the founding of the US and a way to strive to form a more perfect union, was done in a way that was purposely trying to downplay and eschew identity politics, downplay the horrors and legacies of being enslaved, and ultimately restricted public institutions from being able to teach about race in ways that we felt that could be meaningful, at least in the professional development arenas, right? It also noted something I'd love to say that something I was tickled to see that the civil rights program or civil rights movement apparently turned to programs that ran counter to the lofty ideals of the founders, positing the civil rights movement as anti-American in a very fundamental way as part of an educational mandate coming from the Oval Office, right? We haven't had any national mandates for teaching Black history, but this we did receive. Something to keep in mind as well, folks. Much of the country still holds this view and is often threatened by the existence of institutional measures that serve to rewrite what has been that status quo approach. And many teachers who teach Black and Brown students hold this view as well. It serves as a reminder that flashpoints can educate about race in multiple directions. So let me close with the catch-22. I'm nervous about this being a long-term strategy to affect change, we might say. Even though, to be clear, there are many active endeavors to advocate for changing Black history in the K-12 arena to make it more integrated and considered just part of American history, as opposed to a month of poorly formed, poorly done, poorly informed, half-hearted attempts by a small chunk of the populace. Flashpoints seem to bring out that necessary will to act or some sort of sense of justice that informs a desire to see better and that requires more information to do better. But I am nervous about Black death being the central vehicle or even a primary vehicle for being able to engineer change. In terms of developing policies, folks, that's a terrible catch-22 to be in, where it's either there will be a woeful miseducation, or in order to provide more space to develop the kinds of educational tools we'd like to see, we need more flashpoints, which means we need more Black death. I can't personally advocate for needing more Black death as a way to improve education about race, but it does seem like we're stuck with trying to perhaps create something that would develop the same sort of passion as a flashpoint without requiring the kind of harm that a flashpoint ultimately is based on. So I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctors Blum and Torrey, for that. We will open it up for about 25, 30 minutes for questions. Let me ask, perhaps in a devil's advocate type way. I have one for you too, Dr. Torrey, but I'll ask one for Dr. Blum first. All right, you seem to lay out two positions or two criteria for education. One, sort of an integration of space. You don't think that an integration of space alone will sort of promote anything that looks like equality. What you think is that there needs to be pedagogical shifts in addition to an integration of space. Why can't this be leveled against HBCUs insofar as HBCUs would fail the first criteria, which generally is an integration of space? Dr. Torrey, I think, went to an HBCU. Morehouse, I went to a better HBCU, Fisk. So why, I'm playing. Why can't sort of your argument be leveled against either funding or supporting or attending HBCUs? Or can it? Like, do you intend for this to be a denial of the usefulness or the place of HBCUs in civic education?
That's a really excellent question. I definitely don't mean to be casting any aspersions on HBCUs. There, an aspect of my view of integration that I couldn't bring out in the talk is that if you give up the idea that you need integration for equality, you've given up the most powerful argument in favor of, you know, any kind of educational initiative. And so when I shift from resting the value of integration from equality to the kind of civic education, I make this much clearer in the book. I'm recognizing that there are many different values that operate at that terrain. So I mentioned this Navajo school, the Rough Rock Demonstration School. That's a wonderful school. And, you know, there are many wonderful Black high schools, which my argument basically would say there are many positive values that can be realized by single race school. I don't think it can be realized by white single race schools, but I think it can be realized by all other single race schools of people of color. And that there are sort of a plurality of values, and civic value is an important value, but it's not always an overriding value. The way I think of equality as being sort of a more substantial core value that is harder to trump than the civic value. And, you know, as I mentioned, even in primarily Black and brown high schools, there's often quite good civic education that goes on. There's certain limitations to it because of not learning. You know, there's something you miss by not engaging with people of different groups. But nevertheless, it's not as if no good civic education can go on in those kinds of institutions. And of course, that's true at the college level as well.
I was curious to hear Dr. Torrey say, I mean, does he see any possible solutions or things that we could try that would help fix this problem, or we just have to kind of end with a pessimistic picture?
When I was finishing up, I was like, Jesus, somebody gonna ask me what we should do. I'm genuinely torn. So I think the methods that we've been normally you know, what we've been doing that hasn't included people having to get killed and turns into a viral video. These are processes we should continue to support, adopt, and promote. But I'm not entirely sure what carries that same sort of weight. There's something about having to whatever the event is, whatever that thing, whatever those moments are, it has to produce that will to action, that sense of justice. It has to produce both a will to action and a sense of justice. The sense of justice bit I'm thinking of Rodney Roberts' work. Think about a just apology. Right. So there has to be a sense of really having to change the status quo and address an injustice. I don't know what does that kind of work as viscerally, we might say, as these violent moments. But I'm open to finding something else that does it. But I'm also reminded of Derek Bell's Data Storm short story. So hammering information, that doesn't do it. We know we're not educating well enough at the K through 12 level. I think that can help certainly prevent the need for flashpoints, but it does strike me that there has to be something that's got enough pop in the bat, so to speak, to catch national attention. But I don't know what that is short of, well, I shouldn't say I don't know what that is. I know what we have seen and that's been effective so far has been, unfortunately, anti-Black violence. I don't want to rely on that. I would prefer to find something else that did that a whole lot more effectively without the harm. And I'm not advocating for this as a strategy by any means, but I do think, let's say descriptively, this seems to something along those, it's got to have some sort of significant power to capture national attention. And certain, what is it? If it bleeds, it leads, is what they say on the news. So I do know, that kind of thing, it can carry more provocative weight than some of the other stuff that I would think would be so much better. I hope that answers your question, Marilyn. Like I don't like this as a, oh, woe is me, and then it's terrible.
Yeah, but as you said, it's, I guess, I mean, it's a broader problem about intention, perhaps, in the media.
Certainly, I think that's an aspect of this that requires more attention, and likely is getting more attention as I think about it, about not just the role of the media and how we're so here media, we think about like news media, but here also social media and what that medium has been doing for developing and creating these kinds of flashpoints and that sense of, what I say, that will to action, that sense of justice. There's, I think, it's something different from watching it on the news and, it's the news anchor saying it to your friend sharing the thing and asking you, what do you think about it? I think there's something different in the communication mechanisms that might be something that can be marshaled to develop more more flashpoint-like moments as opposed to flashpoints themselves. Let me stop talking.
And I wanted to actually jump in on that conversation you were just having, because I think I always find myself trying to figure out, what is there something that would be fast that we could do, right? You're talking about these flashpoints of violence that really grab the attention of some white people whose attention isn't going to be grabbed any other way. And that sounds to me like a sort of a desire for something that's going to be quick. Like, what can we do that's dramatic, that's going to get everybody's attention? And I worry that there isn't anything. Like, we're a lot of the time it's just going to be a long slog. And what we really need white parents to teach their kids differently from the time they're born. Like, we need white parents talking to their kids about race and teaching them history, not only during Black History Month. We can't leave it up to the school. So it's almost like by the time it's K through 12, there needs to be a foundation before that even. So I'm not sure how we get to that without a lot of really hard work. Different people will be drawn in at different points, but I guess I find some hope in, I think it was in President Biden's inauguration speech when he said, we don't have to get everybody, we just have to get enough people to start to do the work and really start to make a difference. I don't know if either of you would have a response to that in terms of kind of how parenting fits into education and philosophy, and all these things have to kind of work together. But
I think you're very much onto that, Karen. The importance of education is not just in the building, it's also in the home. That is a two-way street. And I guess I go, of course, ideally, they're all moving the same direction. So what you're getting in one, you're getting the other, and they're all, they're reinforcing back and forth, right? It does strike me that, how do I say this? Those flashpoints that I'm describing are helping to provide perhaps the space for the parents that you want to have exist, because those conversations perhaps were not happening prior to them. I think that's how that manifests, because it's, if we don't get the policies in place at the K through 12 level until the school board or the governor or the mayor or whomever is saying that we want that, which requires enough of a population that's saying we want that. These are the kinds of moments that help develop that population. But on the flip side, they then have to, on the back end, continue to do that work. So it can't just be the up in arms anger and the outrage. It has to continue on. Ideally, this is utilizing these tragedies and these terrible moments to be able to develop that community that you're talking about, so that more of that doesn't continue. I think you're onto something for real on that one.
I agree. I agree. I think parents do need to be taking responsibility for this. And I feel somewhat, as it were, cheered by the use of systemic racism, which has kind of like replaced the notion of racism itself. And so many more people use it. They don't really know what they're talking about exactly. But the fact that there's an idea of sort of a bigger picture, I think, should help parents sort of recognize that it's not just this terrible thing that happened to George Floyd, this terrible thing that happened to Breonna Taylor, but that there's some bigger picture. And I think that the COVID In a way, John, I kind of want to know what you thought about this, because the COVID moment has also contributed to a consciousness of racial inequity. It has a very different character than something that a police officer does, but it's exposed these horrible systemic wrongs. And because, people are dying. I mean, so they're dying in both cases, but the way they're dying sort of has a different moral character to it. And I'm hoping that the parents can find some way to talk about the different elements of that system rather than just this terrible thing that happened.
It strikes me as the difference between killing versus letting die. That might be the difference between, say, active forms of the active violence versus, letting the disease kill someone because we're not going to provide you access to adequate health care. I think that distinction is something you can draw out inside of a systemic description, but it's not one you can draw inside an individual description. So I think you're onto something on that one too, Larry.
That's a great point.
I was going to ask about, you said something along the lines of, and correct me if I'm wrong, miseducation. And so my only question is towards miseducation in terms of like textbooks saying that, describing it as immigrants instead of like slaves. What would you do to combat that?
That's a great question. So what's the word? Reveal my hand. I'm 99% sure that's Ronaldo, my student, so I'll see him on Wednesday. And I'm how to stop misinformation from being spread in textbooks. So that's a bit above my pay grade, but that's one of those moments where we have to have better people evaluating the information that's being provided. What is it? Quality control. It must be terrible at Houghton Mifflin or whoever these people that do the textbooks. They have terrible quality control people. We need to do a better job of evaluating what information is being provided, as well as do a better job of seeing who's what are these sources, right? Are these sources, are these reputable sources? Are they valuable sources? Are they consistent sources? Are they strong sources? Because we shouldn't be, making textbooks based off of what grandpa said when you were talking with him. You know what I mean? And that's the kind of version of history that we've more or less made as a status quo with regards to race. So at least that's, on the one hand, with regards specifically to the textbooks, when you see them, so there was a mom who saw that in her kid's textbook. She called out the publisher. They immediately did a retraction, and that was why it blew up and went viral, and they were held accountable in some way, shape, or form. They had to reprint all those books. So one of those is when you see something, say something. And on the other end of that is we have to do a lot better, I think, on quality control, at least in terms of producing a product that's going to be out. That product's got to be pristine, otherwise we shouldn't be sending it out there.
Hi there, John. It's good to see you. So my question is about, so I mean, I guess my question starts from the idea that, well, there's probably actually right now, like more than enough Black death to keep us in like sort of educational moments forever, except that not all Black deaths at the hands of police, sort of become these flashpoints. So I wonder if you've thought about, what makes a how does a particular moment of anti-Black violence become the kind of flashpoint that gets us attention, right? I mean, so could we theoretically have media coverage of all the Black deaths that are, maybe all the ones done by vigilantes and police officers, and would that be enough, or is it impossible to have quite that many flashpoints one after another? What does it take to sort of get the flashpoint around a Black death?
That's a great question. I'm and also wonderful to see you as well, Kamisha. Because we're from the HBCUs that Corey don't want to talk about. That's but that's neither here nor there, Dr. Barnes. I'd say you're absolutely right. We have an overwhelming amount of Black. We can go into the archives insofar as we don't need more to produce. What it takes to make a flashpoint, I know there has been some research on what makes the thing go viral. So some will say that there's it's easier if you're Black and male for this to go viral because we've got more of an emphasis on paying attention to Black male death than say Black female death or Black trans woman death or insert non-Black male death here for all intents and purposes. So that's been seen as a measure. I'm not sure I want to advocate for that as, we want to off the Black guys in order to get seen. This seems about wrong as well. But at least in terms of what seems to be gathering the momentum, tended to be you need to be Black, you need to be unarmed in some way, shape, or form, and or close to what might be an ideal victim in the scenario. Those tended to have been kind of the big ones. The other side of that has also been we've had plenty of people who have been what's the word? They've lived life, we might say, and have still unjustly been put down by vigilantes or by the police. And so the other side of that has been when it's, what is it? There's how did this happen to this person? We don't know how this could have happened to this person because they seem like there's so much on the up and up. And there's also this person is just like me. This person's a member of my community. I could be that person. There's no difference between me and them except for air and opportunity for all intents and purposes. But I gotta be honest, I don't know what really produces it except for the more visceral the story, the more it seems to get traction. The description of Mike Brown getting murdered with shots to the head, that's something I'm never going to forget hearing. It's visceral. You won't forget it. The video of Sandra Bland last being seen from the car, it's visceral. You don't forget it. Walter Scott running away, it's visceral. You don't forget it. It strikes me that something about and this is also something to be said for the videos themselves playing a role. On the flip side, we didn't have video for Breonna Taylor, and while it took a while to get some steam, although the people in Louisville have been being active, it took a while to get some national steam. Eventually, it did pick up. I say all that to say, Kamisha, I'm not sure what actually what takes it to. I don't know what we can look at and go, oh, that's going to happen. You know what I mean? I don't know what one, except for did a lot of people see it? Did a lot of people hear about it? Did a lot of people video or were nearby? And was this person known to the community in some way, shape, or form? Because then the community advocates for that person having been killed, and that, at the very least, I think is a baseline. Regardless of how it's happened, the community advocating for justice for that person seems to be the necessary requisite. And then after that, it's just how high up does it go?
Hi, John. I don't know if you remember me. I'm your middle school principal.
This is a new one.
Hi. I don't have a question for you. I just want to thank you for all the good work that you're doing. Love you.
Thank you, Miss Fiala. I haven't seen Miss Fiala in forever and a day, but love you too. It's so great to see you, and I thank you for coming. Oh man, I'm tickled by it. I didn't see that coming.
Hope I didn't embarrass you.
No, this is my parents are on this line right now, Miss Fiala. There's no embarrassment coming. No, we're good.
Fantastic.
John, I agree with you. I'm sorry, Dr. Torrey, I agree with you. And I'm concerned too about the Hegelian notion that the flashpoints, violence, a little calmness, then violence, and we have a flashpoint, and then all of a sudden we get some action, but the action has to come, unfortunately, at the sake of somebody losing their life. Can you talk a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing as it relates to having and teaching and working with high school and middle school kids in terms of teaching philosophy at a lower level where that may indeed provide not a remedy, but at least to expose younger people to the notion of how they ought to treat others and so forth.
Yeah, cards on the table. That's my father. So I tell you, it's a family affair today. Dr. Blum, you want to get in on this also? Because I know this is how we got together and how we ended up meeting, is doing pre-college philosophy work. Certainly for me, it's the space to be able to do, I forget who it was. I think it might have been Karen earlier that had mentioned it needs to be happening in the home, so to speak, to try to educate widely. For me, doing pre-college philosophy is another way of trying to help supplement education where possible, and give students tools to be able to take in this information and see the 1776 thing and go, oh, something about that doesn't seem right, because giving them the critical thinking skills that are really helpful for analyzing and and critiquing the world they're living in. So I do think they, particularly in the way that I try to do it, I try to make sure that they're, we do lessons on social injustice of all kinds, so that include racial injustice. That is important. Dr. Blum's got a lot more experience in this, however, doing it more formally inside the high school areas. So I'll turn it away to you here, Dr. Blum.
I was the faculty liaison at my university to our outreach program, and I just want to second what John said. We had 6th graders to 12th graders, and I do think it was it met every week at a youth center that's adjacent to the university, and it really did seem like these students were reflecting. I think people involved in that world sort of believe that young people are natural philosophers in a sense. They're always asking why. They don't take things for granted, and it's just the program is fabulous. It's kind of making use of that natural proclivity on their part to then really give them some content. So I retired several years ago, so I'm not involved with that program, but I did teach a course on race and racism 4 times at my own local high school, an extremely racially, ethnically, and economically diverse high school in the pre-Obama period. I wrote a book on that as well. And a thing that I was really heartened by, and I'm wondering if this would still be true, was how these students from different racial backgrounds were able to rise to the challenge of quite intellectually demanding material. Like we read David Walker's a famous Black abolitionist, and he wrote this fantastic a sort of a tract, but it's now in a book form, that had very complex but outraged arguments. And it was sort of fascinating to have the students kind of engage around both the outrage and the arguments. So he would like tear Thomas Jefferson's views apart, but also express incredible outrage against Jefferson. And the students, picked up on very different aspects of it. Some of them saw that David Walker thought it was really important for Black people to, as it were, come up with their own ideas as to why slavery was wrong, and not just sort of accept them from the abolitionist movement. And I felt that, especially for the Black students in the class, was sort of an empowering lesson from this historical figure. So I do think that philosophy can really play a great role in pre-college settings to do, Mr. Jackson, what your question was asking about.
I think we are out of time. I think we'll end here. I would like to thank all of the speakers who presented today. Fantastic jobs with your talks. I would like to thank all of the attendees for attending today, and I would like to remind folks that we have another day of great speakers coming tomorrow who will speak on race and politics, race and medicine, and then race and art. So thank you all.